On February 26, 2025, the United States Department of Agriculture stood on a podium in Washington and announced a $1 billion emergency plan to fight highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAII, the bird flu that had been emptying American egg warehouses for 17 consecutive months. Secretary Brooke Rollins called it a comprehensive strategy. Average retail egg prices at that very moment stood at $6.23 a dozen, the highest single reading in the entire 148-year history of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In the 4 months prior, American importers had quietly brought in more than 26 million dozen shell eggs from Brazil, Honduras, Mexico, Turkey, and South Korea. American consumers had absorbed roughly $14.5 billion in additional egg spending above the pre-crisis baseline, and the administration released the plan without one senior phone call to Ottawa. That is not a logistical oversight. That is a posture. The country that handles 20% of the world's fresh water, that operates more than 31 federal hydroelectric dams on one river system, that runs the cleanest grain-fed egg supply on the North American continent, that country's new prime minister was not on the dance card. Geography outlasts every tariff. There is a phone call that has not been made. There is a quiet procedural decision in Washington that is making Canadians confident and quiet. There are 3-minute news segments that are not going to explain to you why the Department of Agriculture shipped $1 billion through a domestic valve while ignoring a foreign valve that holds half the upstream headwater of the American West. We will explain it. This is not a trade dispute. This is a story about what an empire does when it believes it has no neighbors. The man at the center of the response did not campaign on this fight. He inherited it. I'm Alex Mercer. This is the Decision Room, where we break down the geopolitical, military, and economic decisions that shape the world. No filler, no spin, just the story told straight. To understand why the Trump administration chose not to call Ottawa, you have to travel 77 years into the past. On May 30th, 1948, the Vanport flood wiped out a city. Vanport had been built in 13 weeks during 1943 to house shipyard workers for the Kaiser Corporation at the height of the Second World War. By 1948, 18,500 people lived there, making it the second largest city in the state of Oregon. Almost none of them saw it coming. The Columbia River rose 9 feet above flood stage over 12 hours. 15 people died. 4,600 homes were destroyed in a single night. 60% of Portland's wartime housing was gone in hours. Oregon learned what a river can do when you build a city in front of it without permission. Vancouver, Washington learned the same lesson. Across the line in British Columbia, the province watched and remembered. 16 years later, on September 16, 1964, 2 men sat across a wooden table in Washington and signed the Columbia River Treaty in the kind of neutral diplomatic language that hides an enormous engineering reality. Canadian Ambassador Charles Ritchie and United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk signed it. Operationally, everyone in the room understood. Canada would build 3 storage dams in the Upper Columbia, Mica Dam, Keenleyside Dam, and Duncan Dam, and hold 15.5 million acre-feet of water in reserve. In exchange, the United States would pay Canada $64 million in construction capital. Canada would return roughly half the flood control value as stored electrical energy back to the American Pacific Northwest. The deal was not written by diplomats. It was written by engineers who remembered 1948 and the smell of a wiped-out city. Mica Dam was commissioned in 1973. During peak operations, it ran at 11,000 megawatts of installed capacity, and its storage changed the way the river was managed for the next half-century. 61 years later, that 1964 treaty still governs how electricity flows from Seattle to Boise to Portland. And on September 16, 2024, for the first time in its life, the clock opened, and either country could begin formally withdrawing. Let me describe the asset in both directions. The Columbia River Treaty is a 1964 federal agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of the United States that covers 2,000 kilometers of river stretching from the Columbia's headwaters in southeastern British Columbia to the Pacific Ocean. The treaty created 3 Canadian storage dams controlled by BC Hydro, Mica, Keenly-Side, and Duncan, plus a flood control mechanism that protects Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington, Astoria, Oregon, and roughly 40 other downstream municipalities. The treaty's Canadian entitlement returns approximately 1,200 megawatts of continuous average hydraulic capacity to the United States, roughly the output of 2 large nuclear reactors running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. On the American side, the Bonneville Power Administration markets the power from 31 federal hydroelectric dams and 1 nuclear plant, the Columbia Generating Station, operating across the Pacific Northwest. BPA sells that power to 142 consumer-owned utilities and serves roughly 13 million Americans. Hydropower delivers 60% of the electricity consumed by the people in BPA's service area, accounts for 90% of the region's renewable energy, and provides roughly 50% of the annual generation in the Pacific Northwest. That single asset is the largest clean electricity block in the continental United States, and it is governed by a 1964 deal with a country the United States is currently waging a trade war against. The egg side is just as structural. Canada operates a federal-provincial supply management system that licenses 1,140 registered egg farms and manages roughly 25 million laying hens. Those hens produce approximately 9 billion eggs a year inside a closed quota system. The supply is dependable. Bird flu exposure in the Canadian layer flock since 2022 has stayed below 1%. The province of Saskatchewan alone exports more processed egg products to the United States than any single American state produces. Canada has been sitting on the supply, the water, the grain, the dams, and the biosecurity discipline, while the United States Department of Agriculture ran a $1 billion press release that named 5 importing countries and not the country directly to the north. Now let me walk you through the decision sequence that produced the $1 billion with no phone call. On February 1, 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada. The official rationale cited what the executive order described as the flow of fentanyl across the northern border, a claim that subsequent Canadian government data and U.S. Customs and Border Protection reports contested. The order set a 30-day delayed effective date. On February 3rd, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced 42 billion Canadian dollars in matching counter tariffs on American goods. On February 13th, the Trump administration delayed implementation by 1 month. On February 26th, Secretary Brooke Rollins unveiled the USDA's $1 billion avian flu strategy in Washington. The plan broke down approximately as follows: $500 million for biosecurity upgrades at egg farms, $400 million in indemnification payments to producers whose flocks had been culled, and $100 million for vaccine research and development. Nowhere in the rollout materials did the USDA name Canada as a coordination partner. On March 4th, the 25% tariff went into effect. The order maintained a 10% rate on Canadian energy imports and a 10% rate on Canadian potash, both fertilizers the United States domestic agricultural sector depends on. On March 14th, Mark Carney was sworn in as the 24th Prime Minister of Canada and immediately assumed command of the response file. Throughout April, May, and June of 2025, American egg import volumes from Brazil, Honduras, Mexico, Turkey, and South Korea continued to climb, surpassing 26 million dozen by mid-year. Wholesale egg prices dropped 64% from their Q1 peak, and retail prices dropped 27%. On July 12th, the Trump administration announced a 30% tariff threat to take effect August 1st. Through every one of these decisions, not one named senior official in Washington held a recorded substantive call with the new Canadian Prime Minister. The administration's stated theory was that American domestic capacity, biosecurity upgrades, vaccine research, indemnification, and stepped-up import volumes from 5 countries could solve the bird flu problem on a fast enough timeline to insulate American consumers. They believed they had time. They believed they had the supply. They also believed the Canadian Prime Minister would not push back. Now the miscalculation. The Trump administration's strategic assumption was that the United States could absorb an avian flu shock, a tariff shock, and a trade war shock at the same time, because American food and power systems were domestically insulated. That assumption collapsed the moment the president chose to weaponize the Columbia River Treaty's 2024 termination window against Ottawa. The act of attacking Canada with tariffs revived the leverage that Canada has held over American breakfast tables and American electrical grids since the 1940s. Washington traded partnership for pressure. In doing so, it gave Canada back the standing that Lester Pearson's government quietly traded away in 1964, the standing of a sovereign supplier that does not need to ask Washington's permission. The miscalculation is structural. You cannot run a $1 billion domestic biosecurity plan against a pathogen that has killed more than 200 million American birds since 2022, while simultaneously cutting off the one neighbor on the continent whose commercial egg supply chain has held exposure below 1% for the entire same period. You cannot announce indemnities to American farmers while raising tariffs on the country that grows most of the feedstock grain that those same farmers depend on. Mary Lovely, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, has noted in widely reported commentary that tariffs on Canadian staples function as a tax on the American buyer, and that roughly 90% of the cost is absorbed inside the United States. Lawrence Herman, a Canadian trade counsel at Castles Brock in Toronto, has observed in widely reported commentary that there is no federal infrastructure substitution available to the United States inside any political timeline for Canadian hydroelectric capacity. Dr. Michael Osterholm, the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, has noted in widely reported public health commentary that bird flu in commercial laying flocks reasserts itself within 60 to 90 days whenever a barn restocks after culling, meaning that $1 billion of indemnification payments will not stop the recurrent spikes anywhere close to the timeline Washington is announcing to voters. 3 independent authorities, 3 independent institutions, and 1 quiet, dignified conclusion. The administration turned a coup into a flag and is paying at the register. Now the full measure of the leverage Canada quietly keeps. The Bonneville Power Administration supplies power to 60% of the people in the Pacific Northwest, more than 13 million Americans, and operates roughly 75% of the high-voltage transmission lines in the region. Hydropower delivers 50% of the region's total annual electric generation. The Columbia River and its Canadian tributaries carry roughly half of the Columbia's mean annual flow north of the 49th parallel before it crosses the border. The Columbia River Treaty's Canadian entitlement returns roughly 1,200 megawatts of average continuous capacity to the United States, the equivalent of 2 large nuclear reactors running flat out every day of the year. The aluminum smelters in Ferndale, Washington, the largest single industrial electricity load in the state of Washington, owned by Alcoa and operated since 1969, we depend on hydro. The data centers in Quincy, Washington, the world's densest cluster of cloud server farms, depend on hydro. The new AI training campuses under construction in Hillsboro, Oregon, and Boardman, Oregon, depend on hydro. Every major industrial expansion the Pacific Northwest has announced for the next decade, including $270 billion of announced semiconductor and AI infrastructure through 2030, depends on hydro. In Canada, more than 1,140 registered egg farms operate roughly 25 million laying hens under federal provincial supply management. Canadian annual egg production sits at approximately 9 billion eggs. Cumulative American commercial flock losses crossed 200 million birds since 2022. Canadian bird flu exposure during the same period stayed near zero. The grain supply chain that feeds both flocks runs through three prairie provinces, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, and four American Midwest states, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Minnesota, and the unit trains that move that grain operate on a North American rail network that crosses the same border the administration is now sealing with new inspection regimes. The water flows downhill from Canada into Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. The grid that lights those states flows uphill on Canadian water. The country upstream controls the water. That is not politics. That is geography. If you have been watching this channel for the last 90 days, you have seen the domino chain build one piece at a time. 1. The executive order doubling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50% in March of 2025. 2. The Canadian $36 billion counter tariff on American orange juice, peanut butter, Kentucky whiskey, household appliances, and paper products. 3. The dairy quota fight that is consuming the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Review, scheduled for 2026. 4. The softwood lumber cross-border dispute, the fourth iteration since 1982, that has now seen the United States Commerce Department raise preliminary duties on Canadian lumber to 7.5%. 5. The auto cross-border tariff touching General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis integrated North American supply chains, with an estimated 130,000 American auto workers employed in cross-border plants. 6. The Critical Minerals RMAP, Rapid Assessment of Mineral Pathways, list that excluded Canadian producers from the American defense supply chain preference. Each of those previous dominoes was a fight about a spreadsheet, a tariff line, a quota, or a compliance code. This domino is different. This domino is structural. This domino is a federal farm, a federal dam, a federal treaty, a federal plan, and a federal silence. You cannot replace a river with a tariff renegotiation. You cannot replace 1,200 megawatts of long-term clean storage with a $1 billion press release. You cannot replace 9 billion Canadian eggs of regulated biosecure supply with $1 billion of biosecurity grants to American farmers who are still losing birds at record quarterly rates. You cannot replace the upstream headwaters of the Columbia with an executive order. You cannot renegotiate from weakness the thing you canceled from assumed strength. The previous dominoes cost the United States jobs. This domino is going to cost the United States lights. Scenario 1. Probability 35%. By the second quarter of 2026, Washington picks up the phone to Ottawa. The Trump administration or its successor restores carve-outs in the tariff schedule for Canadian agricultural and energy exports. Cooperation on HPAI vaccine research resumes under the umbrella of the North American Plan for Animal and Pandemic Influenza, a 2012 trilateral framework signed by the United States, Canada, and Mexico that has not been formally invoked during this entire crisis. Average American retail egg prices begin to retrace toward $4 a dozen by the end of 2026 as import volumes from Canada scale toward 40 million dozen. The Columbia River Treaty's renegotiation clock, with termination notice formally possible since September 16, 2024, returns to cooperative modernization under the existing 2024 Agreement in Principle, with a new long-term regime locked in by the summer of 2027. Scenario 2. Probability 40%, the most likely outcome. Cooperation happens on a quiet, working-level basis. State and provincial agriculture officials coordinate behind closed doors on H5N1, sample sharing, and vaccine trial participation. Federal tariffs remain in place through the 2026 midterm cycle. Egg imports from the existing five-nation footprint continue, alongside modest increases from Canadian supply. Wholesale egg prices stay elevated through 2026, but slowly retrace as the U.S. flock rebuilds and import volumes scale. Washington does not name Canada in any public statement about the bird flu response during the entire period. Scenario 3, probability 25%. Rupture. Canada formally signals at a future Columbia River Treaty Ministers meeting that it will exercise its right to seek major renegotiation or, in the worst case, terminate under the treaty's post-2024 framework. Canadian egg and processed poultry exports to the United States quietly throttle. The Pacific Northwest grid faces rolling brownouts during the December, January, and February peak demand windows. Average American retail egg prices spike above $7 a dozen. The administration publicly blames Canada in a televised address without naming the structural fault line. I am putting the third scenario at 25% because nothing in the antagonist's pattern of behavior suggests escalation on the river system, but nothing in their pattern of behavior suggests a phone call either. The character of the decision-makers is the variable the model cannot price. Mark Carney did not start this fight. He inherited it. He has not claimed victory. He has simply maintained leverage that was built by his country over 61 years. The country that holds the water, the hens, the dams, and the grain was not called because the table was set in Washington, and the room was filled with domestic operators, and the 5 importing countries were written in as suppliers, and the country to the north was written out as adversary. The antagonist's refusal to call Ottawa is the tell. They have not mentioned Canada in a single HPAI press conference because mentioning it would expose the structural problem they are quietly praying Canada does not press. Geography outlasts every tariff. The decisions are being made. I will see you when the next one happens.